It happened in the most sacred moment of my life, the moment I was laying my daughter to rest. I remember standing in the front pew of the church, my hands clenched so tightly around the folded program that the paper crumpled. When I saw him, my ex-husband, after 15 years of silence, he strolled down the aisle as if he had every right to be there. As if grief could be faked with a perfectly tailored suit and polished shoes. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe grief was playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. He walked with that same air of entitlement I had once mistaken for confidence. And while my daughter lay in her casket, he positioned himself right beside me, as though he were a grieving father who had earned his place in her story. My chest tightened, but not from sorrow, from fury. I had buried my husband years earlier, and now, at 65, I was burying my only child. My heart was already in pieces. Yet somehow there was still room for fresh anger, because he hadn't come for her. He had come for her money. That was the moment the world shifted. My daughter's life had been worth more than any number could capture. Yet suddenly, in this man's eyes, she was reduced to an estate, to a fortune he had no part in building. He whispered about inheritance, about what he thought he deserved, as though abandoning us for over a decade could be erased with a few legal words. And I sat there, trembling, wondering how a man could look at his child's coffin and think only of dollar signs. The congregation sang hymns. The pastor spoke of Emma's kindness, her brilliance, her extraordinary achievements in just 23 short years. And I watched him nod along, pretending as though he had been there for any of it, pretending as though he had held her hand through the fevers, or encouraged her when she stayed up coding until dawn, pretending as though he had been more than a shadow. Inside me, sorrow and rage twisted together, grief for what I had lost, fury for what he dared to claim. My daughter had been my entire world, and he had walked out when the world got too hard. Now he wanted to reappear, rewriting history for his own convenience. I wish I could say I was surprised, but deep down, I had always known this moment might come. I had always known that the same man who left us when life was heavy would crawl back when fortune was light and easy. And as I looked at him in that church, I realized this wasn't just a funeral anymore. It was the beginning of a battle I had never wanted, but had always half expected. And to understand just how deep the betrayal cut, you'd have to know what came before. You'd have to know the story of how we ended up here, me, my daughter, and the man who once promised to be our family. I can still remember the day everything shattered. Emma was only 8 years old when her father decided that being a husband and father no longer fit into the life he wanted. One evening, he came home distant, distracted, already halfway gone. And by the weekend, his things were packed. There were no long goodbyes, no promises to visit, just silence and a door closing behind him. For weeks afterward, Emma sat at the front window waiting, convinced he would remember something important and come back. She would whisper that maybe he had forgotten her teddy bear, or maybe he'd come by just to tuck her in. But as the days turned into months, she stopped asking. Children learn faster than we give them credit for. They learn when love has left for good. Raising her alone was never easy. I worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, just to keep us afloat. There were nights when I would collapse into bed too tired to think, only to be awakened by Emma's soft voice asking for help with homework or comfort from a nightmare. And somehow, no matter how weary I was, I always found the strength, because she was all I had, and I refused to let her feel abandoned twice. There were beautiful moments too, Saturdays in the park with a picnic basket filled with peanut butter. Sandwiches. Evenings spent huddled over puzzles on our worn-out kitchen table. Times when I caught her smiling in her sleep and thought to myself, this child is the only proof I need that life is still worth fighting for. But beneath it all was a constant ache, a reminder that we had been left behind. Every school play he missed, every birthday without a phone call, every holiday where Emma tried to hide her disappointment, it carved a deeper line between us and him. And now, standing in that church years later, I couldn't help but see the cruel contrast. He had walked away from an 8-year-old girl in pigtails and returned to a polished funeral in an expensive suit, while Emma and I had survived heartbreak and built a life from the ashes. He had been absent, and yet here he was, pretending to belong. That is the story of the broken family he left behind. But what he underestimated was that Emma was never ordinary. From the ashes of abandonment, she built something extraordinary, something that would one day change the world. From the very beginning, Emma was different. She had a spark in her eyes that told me she saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. At 12 years old, while other children were glued to cartoons, she was glued to lines of code on a second-hand laptop I had scraped together. The money to buy. I remember coming home late from work and finding her at the kitchen table, the screen lighting her face in the darkness, her fingers flying as if she were solving puzzles. Only she understood. She looked up at me once, grinning with that wide, determined smile, and said she was figuring out how to fix problems no one else could solve. That was Emma. She always wanted to heal what was broken. Maybe it was because she understood pain so young, because she knew what it was like to be left behind. While I tried to shield her from it, I think her father's absence shaped her more than I realized. She wanted to make sure others wouldn't suffer in silence. By the time she was 16, she had built her first app. At 19, she stunned me by saying she was leaving college to join a tech accelerator program. I'll admit, I panicked. I worried she was throwing away her future for a dream that might never pay the bills. But she looked at me with those serious green eyes and told me she wanted to change the world. She wanted to fix the way medical data was stored and accessed so that families wouldn't lose precious time or coverage because of missing records. She remembered the nights when bills and forms piled up after her father left. The way hospitals seemed to lose track of important information when we needed it most. She carried those memories like fuel. The company she created, MedSecure, grew faster than I could ever have imagined. Hospitals began using her system, investors poured in, and soon the newspapers were calling her a prodigy. I watched her sit in meetings with men twice her age, holding her ground with calm authority. And every time I saw her succeed, my heart swelled with pride so fierce it almost hurt. But success came at a cost. The late nights, the endless travel, the crushing responsibility it weighed on her. She was only 23, still barely more than a girl. And yet she carried the burdens of an empire. I remember the night she came home after being featured in Forbes. She didn't celebrate. She cried in my arms from sheer exhaustion. And then came the illness, leukemia, so sudden and merciless. For months, I sat by her side as chemotherapy drained the strength from her body, but never the determination from her eyes. Even when her hair thinned and her hands trembled, she was still typing, still planning, still determined to leave something behind that mattered. It breaks me even now to think about it. She built so much from so little, turned abandonment into invention, and left a mark on the world before she was even old enough to rent a car. And as I sat in that church during her funeral, trying to honor the life she fought so hard for, I watched the man who had abandoned her nodding along as if he had been part of her story. That was when I realized the pain of loss was about to turn into something else entirely. The church was heavy with silence as the pastor spoke of Emma's brilliance, her kindness, her ability to light up rooms she walked into. Yet all I could see, just out of the corner of my eye, was the man who had left her behind now playing the role of grieving father. He shook hands with her colleagues, bowed his head when people spoke of her accomplishments, even managed to conjure the glimmer of a tear when the choir sang her favorite hymn. It was a performance, and a flawless one at that. I sat rigid in my pew, forcing myself to breathe evenly while inside. Every memory of his absence burned like fire. He hadn't been there for the coding lessons at the kitchen table, the long nights of hospital stays, the nights Emma cried herself to sleep missing him. Yet here he was, nodding as if he had earned the right to mourn. What he didn't know, what gave me the strength not to collapse under the weight of anger, was that Emma had anticipated this. She knew him better than he knew himself. In the weeks leading up to her passing, Emma had quietly prepared for the possibility that her father might resurface. She left instructions, carefully worded, with people she trusted. One of them was Victoria, her mentor, who had guided her through the business world with wisdom and fierce loyalty. As the service ended and mourners drifted away, Victoria caught my arm and held my gaze with the kind of gravity that told me she carried more than condolences. Later that evening, in the quiet of my kitchen, she revealed the truth. Emma had put safeguards in place. She had worked with attorneys to ensure her father couldn't touch her fortune. Not a single dollar of the $35 million she had built. She had documented everything: his abandonment, his legal choices, his complete absence. The realization hit me with equal parts sorrow and pride. My daughter had spent her final months not only fighting for her life, but also preparing to protect me from the very man who had caused us so much pain. Even as her body weakened, her mind was strong enough to anticipate the storm he would bring. I sat there, clutching the folder Victoria placed in front of me, filled with evidence and legal protections. And I felt a surge of emotions I could hardly name. Grief for the child I had lost, anger at the man who dared to return, but also pride, and overwhelming pride that my Emma had not only built a company, but also built a fortress to keep us safe long after she was gone. Looking back at the funeral that day, I realized it was more than a goodbye. It was the opening scene of a battle Emma had prepared me for. And soon, the performance my ex-husband had perfected would begin to crumble under the weight of truth. The legal fight was coming, and this time, he would not be the one walking away unscathed. The very next morning, my doorbell rang. When I opened it, there he stood, my ex-husband, flanked by a man in a sleek suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced him as his attorney, and I knew at once this was no longer about grief. This was war. We sat stiffly in my living room, a space still crowded with Emma's photos and little reminders of a life he'd chosen to abandon. His lawyer began with practiced courtesy. Speaking of reasonable settlements and avoiding costly litigation, they talked about legal standing, about how Rob was still Emma's father, about rights he supposedly held. My heart pounded, but I held my ground. Because I had something they didn't, the knowledge that Emma had already outmaneuvered him. The cracks began to show quickly. His lawyer spoke carefully, almost hesitantly, as if he wasn't fully convinced of the case he'd been hired to defend. When he mentioned maintains parental rights, I caught the wording deliberately cautious, not certain. I pressed for clarity. That was when his lawyer's expression shifted. The way a man looks when he realizes he's been misled. Slowly, the truth emerged. Years ago, in order to avoid paying child support. Rob had legally terminated his parental rights. He had cut ties not just emotionally, but legally, with his own daughter. He had chosen $300 a month over fatherhood. And now he wanted to stand in my living room and claim $35 million. I felt fury surge through me, but also something else, a deep, unexpected satisfaction. Because Emma had known. She had discovered those documents, tucked them away, and used them as the cornerstone of her protection. She had built her defenses not on hope, but on facts that would withstand any courtroom. As more evidence surfaced, his unraveling became undeniable. Emma's mentor and attorneys revealed files she had compiled testimony from, women he had deceived, records of financial exploitation, and his long trail of abandonment. Piece by piece, the mask he had worn at the funeral cracked. He wasn't a grieving father. He was a man with a pattern. A predator who used people until they no longer served him. I watched him grow pale as his own lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had walked into this fight expecting weakness, expecting a mother too broken by grief to resist. Instead, he found himself up against the foresight of the daughter he had left behind. For me, it was more than just justice. It was vindication. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every tear Emma and I had shed when he walked away now carried new meaning. He hadn't just lost his daughter's love 15 years ago. He had signed away his claim to her future. When his lawyer finally stood and said he needed to review additional information before proceeding, I saw defeat flicker in my ex-husband's eyes. The confidence he had carried into my home was gone, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar fear. That night, as I sat surrounded by Emma's papers, I realized she had done more than protect her money. She had protected me, even in her last days. She had been thinking about how to shield me from more pain. And this was only the beginning. Because while the legal battle had exposed his lies, Emma had left behind something even more powerful. A final message. A legacy that would outshine his greed and ensure her story was remembered for what it truly was. The day I found her letter, I sat alone in Emma's bedroom, surrounded by the reminders of the life she had so carefully built. Her books lined the shelves. Her laptop still sat on the desk where she had spent countless hours coding, and the faint smell of her favorite vanilla lotion lingered in the air. My hands shook as I opened the envelope with my name written in her handwriting so delicate, yet so steady even in the midst of her illness. Inside was a letter that spoke directly to me, as if she were sitting beside me again. She wrote that she knew her father would come back, not out of love or grief, but out of greed. And she told me not to worry, because she had already taken care of everything. She had worked with lawyers, mentors, and investigators to ensure that the man who abandoned us could never take what we had built together. But beyond the legal safeguards, she spoke of something greater, her vision for what her fortune should mean. After she was gone, Emma didn't see her wealth as money. She saw it as a tool to help children who had lived through the same kind of abandonment she had. She wanted scholarships, counseling, and support programs for kids left behind by parents who chose selfishness over responsibility. She had even partnered with advocates and lawmakers to push for stronger protections for children, drafting the early stages of legislation that would one day carry her name. Reading those words, tears streamed down my face. My daughter had been fighting two battles at once, her illness and her father's shadow, and somehow she had turned both into something extraordinary. She wasn't just protecting me. She was protecting generations of children she would never meet. While Emma's legacy grew brighter, her father's world crumbled. The truth about his terminated parental rights spread quickly once he tried to press his claim in court. Journalists uncovered his long history of abandoning families, leaving a trail of broken promises and unpaid debts. And when evidence of identity fraud and financial schemes surfaced, there was no escaping the consequences. The man who had once strutted into Emma's funeral in a designer suit ended up in a prison uniform, stripped of the illusions he had built his life upon. I wish I could say that watching his downfall gave me peace. But the truth is, peace didn't come from his punishment. It came from Emma, from knowing that even in her final months, she had chosen love over bitterness, purpose over anger. She could have spent her last days consumed by fear or resentment. But instead, she poured her energy into ensuring that no child would feel as unwanted as she once did. That is the legacy that matters. Not the 35 million she left behind, but the compassion, the strength, and the determination to turn pain into hope. Her father gave her life, but he never gave her love. And yet, she grew into a woman who gave more love to the world than he could have. Imagined, I still live in the same house where Emma grew up. Her photos are on the walls. Her laughter still echoes in my memories. And every time I see a letter from a student who received one of her scholarships, or a family who found comfort in the foundation she created, I feel her presence. She is gone, but she is everywhere. To anyone listening now, I want you to take this with you. Our true inheritance isn't measured in money. It's measured in the lives we touch, the love we give, and the courage we show when life tries to break us. Emma taught me that. She turned abandonment into armor and heartbreak into a legacy that will outlive us all. If this story touched you, I invite you to share your own experiences in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, and let others know they are not alone in their struggles. And if Emma's story reminded you of the strength that can come from love, I hope you'll subscribe and stay connected. Because every voice matters, and sometimes sharing our stories is the very thing that keeps someone else going.